Howdy, y'all. On December 29th, 2021, conservative news outlet The Daily Wire released a video called The PragerU Story, a short documentary. The video is a self-gratifying circle jerk in every sense of the phrase, a gushing profile of the first 10 years of the group, a testament to both PragerU's longevity and the insular cooperative nature of conservative media. But this is not a video about the documentary, nor is it a video about the Daily Wire. In the beginning of the documentary, PragerU personality Amala Ekpanobi introduces the question, what is PragerU? And that is the question that I aim to tackle over the course of this video and several more to be released soon. I hope that this series can be a valuable resource, not only to those unfamiliar with PragerU, but also to those who've known about it for years, whether they like or dislike it, and perhaps even to those personally involved with it. First, let's get the obvious out of the way. Prager University is not an actual university. In 2009, Dennis Prager, who was at the time just a conservative radio host and author, and Alan Estrin, his producer, had the idea to create Prager University. The original plan was to build an actual university, before they realized that building a physical school is pretty expensive, actually. They instead decided to create a YouTube channel that would offer courses, which were just YouTube videos. In 2011, Marissa Streit joined the project as CEO, and they began releasing YouTube videos. Frankly, I just can't imagine PragerU as an actual, real university. It just seems fundamentally at odds with the anti-intellectual rhetoric they so often espouse. The videos cover a variety of topics, but one thing unites them all: a polished veneer of respectability. A PragerU video has snappy editing and animations that, well, they're not good, but they have animations. The speakers wear suits and are shot professionally, and they're often people with fancy-sounding credentials. The videos are narrated in an authoritative tone designed to give the impression of an academic lecture. The idea of a PragerU video is that you are being taught objective truth from an expert in the topic. But take a peek behind the veil, and this illusion shatters. PragerU has become notorious for using graphs in their videos that convey absolutely no valuable information. Take, for example, this graph. As you can clearly see, it plots injustice and suffering over, life, okay, and as you can clearly see, injustice and suffering is going up over life. By how much, I have no idea. It isn't labeled properly, and eventually it becomes immeasurable, even though the bounds of the graph don't actually end. Well, okay, maybe that's just a bad one. Let's look at more graphs just to get a better sample. Okay, so this one makes a lot more sense. So capitalism is the little rectangle, whereas socialism is the big rectangle. Although this one is also missing some info, so let me just, there, fixed it. Now, mocking the graphs is fun, but I suspect it's not terribly convincing for any PragerU fan. The animations are just visual aids after all, so it doesn't matter if they don't make sense. While this isn't the soundest of logic, I would be willing to accept it. But if the graphs are meaningless, then where is the actual evidence to back up the claims? PragerU lists their sources for their 5-minute videos on their website, but just because they have sources doesn't mean what they're saying is the truth. For any individual claim made in a PragerU video, you may go to the source list and find that there's no source for the claim, that the source is a dead link, that they've cited themselves, which they do a lot, that the source contradicts their claim, that the source itself is dubious, or in rare cases, the source is legitimate. But an argument built on mostly lies with 1 or 2 facts is like a table where half the legs are spaghetti. Bad. PragerU's reasoning for their lack of sources is that their presenters are experts, and that the viewer can find the evidence for themselves. Their source is literally, just trust me, bro. This is not a PragerU debunking video, but I will link some of those by myself and others in the video description so that you can see just how shoddy the narratives pushed actually are. And when you realize how little the evidence holds up, you start to re-examine the supposed expert speakers. PragerU is desperate to get anyone with doctor in their name to do a video, because it lends the video, and by extension PragerU, an unearned air of respectability. But even these PhDs are bottom of the barrel. PragerU recently did a series on whether belief in science and belief in God are incompatible. A potentially interesting discussion until the video starts and you realize it's just 25 minutes of creationist talking points. This is narrated by Stephen Meyer, who has a doctorate in the history and philosophy of science. But as far as actual understanding of science goes, Stephen demonstrates none. Take this tweet, where Stephen quotes his own creationist blog, saying that a similar evolutionary pattern between the ears of crickets and vertebrates refutes Darwinian evolution. But as any high school freshman who paid attention in biology class could tell you, disparate species evolving similar structures is not a refutation of evolution. Convergent evolution is a process by which species trend towards filling the same niche independent of each other. While this isn't exactly convergent evolution, a similar idea of species evolving in the same manner still applies, as the authors of the actual scientific paper that this blog post is based on indicate. Stephen Meyer is a prime example that a degree is meaningless if one lacks intellectual honesty. And that's one of the most accredited PragerU speakers that there is. Most of them are just conservative commentators and grifters. People like Steven Crowder, who failed at being an actual comedian, so now he just tells homophobic jokes to make the world's angriest people laugh. Candace Owens, who was an anti-Trump activist until she learned how to make more money grifting to the Trump crowd. Will Witt, a college student who watched a bunch of PragerU videos one day and then dropped out to go make SJW-owned compilations with PragerU. And Mike Rowe, a theater kid who followed his passion and went to college and now plays the role of a blue-collar tough guy while telling kids not to follow their own passions. And then there's the ones who are just vile, like Owen Benjamin, a right-wing comedian whose several PragerU videos were deleted after he kept doing things like saying the moon landing was faked, saying the KKK are better than progressives, calling Obama the N-word, calling Greta Thunberg a demon troll, a bitch, and a gremlin, harassing David Hogg about his pubic hair, calling Anne Frank a coomer, calling Jewish people just a lot of bad things, saying Jewish people control the media, claiming Hitler was cleaning Germany of parasites, denying the Holocaust, which is a weird position to have if you're also going to claim Hitler was cleaning Germany of parasites, but, Nazis aren't known for being consistent, I guess. So, yeah, not a great look on PragerU's part, but, everyone has a Nazi do several videos for them once in a while, right? I mean, no. Not at all. But maybe it was just a one-time thing. And it was. Until late in 2021, when they had to delete a video by Karlin Borisenko, because the star of a video about how a Trump rally made her realize what reasonable and happy people conservatives are, went on Twitter and said, "Everyone who died in the Holocaust chose to die in the Holocaust before they were ever born, because they collective wanted to understand the feeling of ultimate oppression. That's why Hitler went to heaven." And nobody else had even brought up Hitler or the Holocaust, so, she just really wanted to put this one out there. When you see the speakers, facts, and visuals for what they really are, the PragerU formula becomes clear. These are not a semester in 5 minutes. They're the same tired conservative talking points Dennis Prager and his ilk have pushed their entire careers. The only difference is that now he can pay YouTube to make you see it. But when you're just seeing the ads or watching a video here and there, you only see the veneer of respectability. PragerU loves to boast about how many people change their minds on a topic after watching one of their videos. This is the reason the right are such big fans of the free marketplace of ideas. Much like in the actual markets, in the absence of regulation, there's nothing stopping liars from getting ahead. The right does not have better ideas. We've seen that time and time again. Conservative politics fail on an economical, social, and scientific level, but when given the ability to just lie and have your ideas go largely unchallenged, people will be far more likely to be convinced by your faulty arguments. This is especially true because of who PragerU videos target. The animations, the authoritative tone, the name Prager University. These videos are made for teens and kids, and the advertising is heavily focused towards targeting young people. This is because, and absolutely no offense intended to young people here, but when you're new to political arguments, you tend to be a lot worse at recognizing when someone is lying. You just don't really have the experience to know how to check someone's claims and where to look for information. And also, a lot of people never learn how to do this, but that's besides the point. PragerU tries to cast itself as an equal authority to someone like a teacher, someone who a very young person is unlikely to believe would, or even could, mislead them. So that's what a PragerU video is. But why have they gained so much traction? Well, in addition to being in a very shareable format, their videos are only 5 minutes after all, PragerU also has a massive advertising budget. About 40% of the total budget, which was $20 million in 2021, is spent on marketing. This is primarily done by paying to put their videos as ads on YouTube and other platforms. If you're a young person or watching anything remotely political, you are going to get a lot of PragerU ads. YouTube's algorithm also pushes PragerU content heavily. Their videos usually get more than 1 million views on YouTube alone, with several having well over 10 million. And across all platforms, videos can get over 50 million views. PragerU is able to advertise so much because of their big money donors that pour cash into the organization. PragerU's biggest donors are often mistakenly assumed to be the Koch brothers. Or, I guess it's just brother now. Rest in piss, bozo. But it's actually a different pair of fossil fuel billionaire brothers, the Wilks brothers. The Wilks bros are comparatively less notorious than the Kochs, but they essentially do the same thing, putting their fracking money towards various Christian conservative causes. About $7 million of PragerU's early funding came from the Wilks bros, so when you see a video like, "Are pipelines safe?" that's why. As for the other funding, notable donations include over $200,000 from the Lynd and Harry Bradley Foundation, also known as the group that funds Wisconsin Governor Scott Walker and anti-Islamic hysteria. PragerU has also received about $7 million from the 13 Foundation, a major anti-abortion group that one of the Wilks bros is a trustee of. It also seems that if you're a conservative donor, you can just pay PragerU to make a video. At the end of their video, "Get Politics Out of Sports," a message displays reading,
"This video was made possible by a generous donation from the T.W. Lewis Foundation,"
which is a foundation owned by a former real estate mogul that gives away money. These large money donations, in addition to dark money and donations from viewers, are why PragerU reported over $36 million in revenue for 2021. Accounting for the $20 million in expenses, the organization made $16 million last year. Their nonprofit status requires them to make the salaries of their highest level employees public, and they're all earning hundreds of thousands, with the CEO, Marissa Streit, making $500,000 per year. Curiously, Dennis Prager's salary is not listed, which leads one to the terrifying thought that he's doing this all for pleasure. But even if he is, he's still worth $12 million, so keep that in mind when he rants about the elites. The nonprofit status also means that PragerU can't directly advocate for any political candidates, but this hasn't exactly stopped them. In the run-up to California's 2021 recall election, PragerU posted several tweets praising and promoting Republican candidate Larry Elder. You want to know how obvious this was? In August and September, they posted about Elder 16 times. Since September, they have posted about him exactly once. This also means that they cannot directly endorse Donald Trump, but they can make videos defending his statements, such as their video, "What Happened in Charlottesville?" where they lie about the history surrounding the events in Charlottesville to make Trump look like less of an obvious white supremacist. If you were to stop watching this video now, you'd likely leave with the impression that PragerU is a conservative group that makes unfounded right-wing arguments geared primarily towards kids. And while this is an accurate impression, it's not exactly complete. PragerU does not merely make tired, Reagan-esque arguments. Upon closer examination, their content is often far more radical than they let on. In November 2019, PragerU tweeted, "Multiculturalism is erasing culture. Europeans need to start speaking out or watch their cultures disappear." Will Witt breaks it down. Accompanying this tweet is a video by Will Witt, who, I'll remind you, was self-reported as right-leaning in college before he dropped out after watching PragerU videos. In this video, however, Will Witt says some very far-right stuff, such as,
"Let's talk about Paris, the city of lights. Too bad Paris is no longer Paris. It's now infested with rats, graffiti, high crime, sexual assault, just to name a few.
And also,
This mass immigration to Europe is not a melting pot of culture. These people are not assimilating. It is forced multiculturalism that is destroying Europe."
You know, I would say this is a clear dog whistle for xenophobia and white genocide rhetoric, but when you're just straight up calling immigrants rats who are destroying the country, you clearly abandoned the dog whistle long ago. And as long as we're talking about Will, what does he think about rape?
Yo, rape is hilarious.
Yo, why?
Lovely. PragerU has led Will down the path to overt white supremacy, and he now seeks to lead others down that same path. There are thousands of other Will Witts out there because of PragerU. The YouTube algorithm also contributes to another negative effect of PragerU. Many on the left have noted how the algorithm will lead people to increasingly radical right-wing content. There is definitely a stylistic difference between the man in a suit and tie talking about immigration and the guy in his bedroom screaming white genocide. But the algorithm thinks that if you liked one, you're gonna like the other. PragerU is adjacent to many more blatantly white supremacist speakers, who a teen may rightly recognize as just a racist without a steady stream of increasingly radical content to prime them. There are plenty of overt white supremacists who credit PragerU to be in their red pill moment. I suspect many will take issue with how I characterized the situations of Owen Benjamin and Karlin Borisenko, the two PragerU speakers who would later profess their love for Hitler. I imagine many will consider it unfair to judge PragerU for the actions that their speakers committed after making their videos. And after all, they did delete the videos that the two featured in. But I think PragerU needs to do some serious introspection on why the people they align themselves with so often do stuff like this, and the role that they play in radicalization, both of their speakers and their audience. Dennis Prager is Jewish, and while I fervently disagree with his views, I sincerely believe and hope that he is not intentionally stoking anti-Semitic sentiment. Although I want to make clear, I do believe that he's intentionally stoking anti-Islamic, anti-LGBTQ, and anti-immigrant sentiment, but that's a whole nother issue. But if you share the same politics as the far or alt-right on every position but anti-Semitism, you're going to find yourself allied with a lot of anti-Semites, whether you like it or not. And if PragerU isn't at fault for having speakers who turn into neo-Nazis, then surely they must at least be at fault for amplifying the message of known neo-Nazis, right? Meet Mark Collett. Collett is a British neo-Nazi. He was the former chairman of the fascist British National Party, as well as the subject of the documentary Young, Nazi, and Proud. On July 17, 2020, Mark Collett shared a video on Twitter with the following caption: "A white couple are brutally set upon in an airport, and the white man desperately tries to protect his girlfriend as what appears to be airport security simply stand and watch. I doubt this will be covered by the media, but you can bet that it would have if the races were reversed." The video presents a white couple being attacked by a group of black people. Missing from Collett's video is the beginning, where the white woman initiated the conflict. By removing this, Collett seeks to portray black people as violent, as well as create the impression that violence perpetrated on white people by black people is covered up. PragerU saw this Nazi propaganda from the Nazi and decided to retweet it with the caption, "Hey, CNN, will you cover this?" Despite Collett being one of the most well-known neo-Nazis in Britain, and literally the first Google image search result for him displaying a swastika, PragerU both agreed with and amplified his message. Perhaps they just didn't know who Collett was, and did not care to research before retweeting him to their, at the time, 500,000 followers. Fortunately, commenters pointed out to PragerU both that Collett was a known Nazi and that the video was edited. This was not a scheduled tweet, so perhaps the Twitter person for PragerU would see them. But the tweet stayed up all day, getting over 10,000 likes and thousands of retweets, including one from Donald Trump Jr., the president's son. After spreading Nazi propaganda to hundreds of thousands of people, PragerU eventually deleted the tweet that evening and have not commented on the situation since. I sincerely wish that this event would have led to an epiphany. Are they too irresponsible with not researching the things they present to their audience? Why did they so desperately want to believe this Nazi propaganda? Why had their audience wanted to believe the same? But this did not happen, and I am led to believe that PragerU is not operating purely out of ignorance and an unwillingness to learn. Karlin Borisenko and Owen Benjamin had their videos deleted, but how many speakers have done nearly the same with no consequence? Will Witt spread white supremacist talking points about immigration. Candace Owens said that Hitler would have been fine had his ambitions been confined to Germany. Both of them have their own separate shows with PragerU, and PragerU may have deleted the videos by Benjamin and Borisenko, as well as the tweet by Collett, but it's not like they ever made a follow-up post saying, "Hey, that was an edited video from a neo-Nazi. Whoops." In each situation, the damage had already been done. As a speaker, your relationship with PragerU only ends when the backlash against the horrible things you say outweighs your value to the organization, and you can go very far before crossing that line. One of the most egregious examples of extremism in their core 5-minute video series comes from the September 2021 release, What Radical Islam and the Woke Have in Common, presented by prominent anti-Islamic activist Ayaan Hirsi Ali. One would think that the only thing the two groups have in common is that conservatives hate both of them, and after watching the video, this idea is fully validated. She spends 2 minutes just listing off things that she thinks make radical Islam and wokeism the same. Here are some of my personal favorites.
The two ideologies have distinctive rituals. Islamists shout Allahu Akbar and death to America. The woke shout Black Lives Matter and I can't breathe.
You heard it here first, folks. Islamic terrorists and woke people both shout things. Conservatives would never do something like that.
Stop those steal! Stop those steal! Stop those steal! Stop those steal!
Oh, moving on.
Islamists pray to Mecca. The woke take the knee.
And they both kneel. Can't think of anyone else who kneels. Did I mention that PragerU is an explicitly religious organization, by the way? Fun aside, Ali's comparisons are just a pathetic attempt to paint everyone that she doesn't like with the same brush. Her refusal to acknowledge any white supremacist extremism is also notable. But the most important part of the video comes at the end.
I cling to the hope that most Americans are still willing to fight and, if necessary, to die to preserve our freedoms, our rights, our customs, our history. That was the spirit of Flight 93. We need to summon that spirit again.
Now, really think about what she's said here. In the most generous possible interpretation, she is saying that both radical Islam and progressives pose an existential threat to America, and that people should be willing to die to defend against them. Already bad. But I suspect that many listened to her and came away with a message more akin to race war now. Here, PragerU is painting a horrible caricature of Islam and the left, and encouraging their followers to be willing to die fighting them. It sounds like a cult, doesn't it? This content is far more extreme than it lets on, and it leads people to yet even further extremes. It takes the inherent trust kids have for their teacher figures and uses it to push unfounded, unscientific narratives. It's backed by billionaires and dark money. It is vile. What is PragerU? That is. Now, videos are what people think of when they think of PragerU, and for the vast majority of people, that will be pretty much all of their interaction. Just a few videos here and there. But then there are the outliers, the people who consume a frightening amount of PragerU content. If this is you and you don't like the content, well, then you're me. But if you love PragerU, you join PragerFORCE. So what is PragerFORCE? Is it a reference to how Dennis Prager thinks a wife should be forced to have sex with her husband, whether or not she wants to? Well, no, but good guess. Are you looking ahead in my script, actually? No, PragerFORCE is actually the PragerU student organizing group. PragerU is not merely content to advertise to young people. They want young people to join them and then advertise their material to others. When you head to the PragerFORCE section on PragerU's website, you're met with this list of benefits to joining.
Become part of a network with thousands of other young patriots.
Yeah, this is code for access to a Facebook group.
Get access to exclusive events, both in person and virtually. Meet leaders in the movement. Opportunities to be featured in PragerU content. Professional development and job opportunities. Fight for American values and make a difference.
Well, frankly, I'm sold. I want to make a difference. And leaders in the movement could be anyone. Maybe I'll even get to meet Ronald Reagan. So, in the interest of doing the best reporting that I can, I applied to become a member of PragerFORCE myself. But to join, you need to link your Twitter or Instagram. And my actual Twitter and Instagram are pretty clearly not a conservative teen. So I needed to make a fake account. And thus, I assumed the identity of
Chuck Wilson, a no-nonsense kind of guy who's headed up to here with these woke professors and SJW propagandists. I submitted my application and waited for the acceptance email.
Unfortunately, it's been a week, and Chuck still hasn't been accepted. I'm not exactly sure why I wasn't selected. Could it have been that I put my birthday as 6'9"? Could it have been that my only tweet was,
"What up, Twitter? Who's ready to get chucked?"
Maybe it was that I said I attended the Central University of Michigan, which isn't a real college, but does spell out cum. Regardless of what it was, I knew I wouldn't be able to get an insider's look. But the thing is that the kind of kid who would join PragerFORCE is also the kind of kid that absolutely will not shut up about being part of PragerFORCE. So I went ahead and found myself a PragerFORCer. Is that what they're called? I'm just going to go with it. Meet Gabriel Xavier St. Charles. Gabriel is a conservative Catholic from Singapore who runs his own podcast. Because of course he does. In addition to this, Gabriel is an official PragerFORCE influencer. So I thought we'd check out his video, What's Inside a PragerU Influencer Box. Let's start out by hearing what happened when Gabriel joined PragerFORCE.
I joined PragerFORCE in about January last year, and you know the story. 3 weeks later, I was flown out to LA, got to meet my conservative heroes, Ben Shapiro, Dennis Prager, yada yada yada. Really awesome stuff, life-changing story. You can watch all about it on my channel, on my Instagram. I really can't stop talking about that story. I mean, who could, It's one of those Peter Parker stories where you get bitten by a radioactive spider and then the next day you wake up with superpowers. It's one of those stories, and these things, they don't happen to just... They don't just happen to anyone.
His Peter Parker story. Spider-Man was a comic about meeting Ben Shapiro. PragerFORCE is just like getting bitten by a radioactive spider. I wore a PragerU t-shirt and I became a superhero. Well, you know, at this point, I just gotta see what's in the box.
So now I have finally managed to open up this box. So let's reveal what's inside. All right, 1, 2, 3. Oh, wait, gotta make sure it's in the camera frame. 1, 2, 3, boom. Oh, that's not very, darn it. That's not very exciting, is it? Darn it.
It certainly is, Gabriel.
College life, you know, I always wanted that experience. I always felt like I missed out, but now that I'm part of, you know, Prager University, hey, I kind of got a bit of a taste of that.
I don't want to be academically biased here, but no, watching a YouTube video about how feminism is bad is not getting the college experience.
All right, and I have some stickers. Oh, a fridge magnet. Oh, all right, a pop socket. A badge. I like badges. And some stickers. Right, another badge and a t-shirt. Wow. Honestly, my favorite part of this package is the box. I like having these nice boxes.
You know, if you give someone something and they compliment the box, it means the inside had nothing good in it. So, yeah, the box is just full of a bunch of PragerU merch. You know, as expected, the only real benefits one gains from being a PragerU influencer is becoming even more of a walking billboard for the organization. I say even more because pretty much the only thing PragerFORCE members do is promote PragerU content. If you look up #PragerFORCE on Twitter, you'll see Sonic porn from people spamming the hashtag. But when you go past that, it's just a couple teenagers with like 20 followers reposting PragerU videos. Or in some cases, just posting the hashtag itself over and over again. I see you, Rohan. I'm not exaggerating when I say PragerFORCE is just PragerU's unpaid advertisements. And I say this with full confidence because y'all remember how I said PragerFORCE didn't reply to my application within a week? Well, it turns out that my abysmal upload schedule came in handy. Because 3 weeks after my initial application, I finally heard back from them. Sorry, Gabriel, but it looks like this does happen to just anybody. And this second application lays out all the things you can do as a member of PragerFORCE. You can make calls, fundraise, work for them, and make a video, which they'll probably use to fundraise. At this point, I just have some honest advice for any conservative kid thinking about joining PragerFORCE. Just don't. This isn't even just because I don't like PragerU. I don't like PragerU, but there's better options for literally anything you think PragerFORCE would do for you. Want to get politically active? Work for a campaign. You get way more political experience talking to voters than you ever will retweeting a PragerU video. Want to be an influencer? Well, nobody likes an influencer who's just constantly doing promo for some brand. I've scrolled through hundreds of tweets from PragerFORCE members, and literally no one is liking these. For something as easy as being a conservative influencer, it's genuinely crazy to see how bad the PragerFORCE kids are at it. Do you want to meet Ben Shapiro and Dennis Prager so you can have your Peter Parker moment? Get better dreams. When you join PragerFORCE, you're not making a difference. You're not becoming an influencer. You're just stroking Dennis Prager's massive ego. Youth is precious, and you really shouldn't waste yours on that. You know, I would be kind of worried about turning a bunch of teens towards working on Republican campaigns and becoming conservative influencers. But fortunately, no conservative was going to watch this far into the video anyways. So we've seen that there's plenty of ways for PragerU to get their content in front of kids. They can advertise it to them directly on YouTube, they can have other kids share it to them via PragerFORCE, But if you want to put right-wing propaganda in front of a kid, then the most effective route is to bring it to them through the people that they aren't allowed to ignore, their parents and their teachers. And that's where PrEP comes in. PrEP, short for PragerU Resources for Educators and Parents, is PragerU's outreach organization for teachers and parents. Essentially, it gives them resources that they can use to indoctrinate their kids. When we go to the page for PrEP on the PragerU website, we're greeted with a depiction of Dennis Prager as a small child holding the US flag. Now frankly, that seems like some Freudian shit that I do not want to unpack here. So let's just watch the Why You Should Join PrEP video.
We have an issue in this country, in most private schools and pretty much all public schools, where kids are receiving information, education, indoctrination that run counter to their parents' values.
I woke up big time in terms of learning what my kids were being educated about in schools. I woke up about what narratives are being pushed.
A lot of parents have not recognized that in the past, only until their kids grew up and had values that ran counter to them.
Okay, so PrEP, much like PragerU in general, exists as a reactionary pushback to kids learning stuff that conservatives don't like. While the way kids are educated hasn't changed much throughout US history, the curriculum has shifted over the years. Compared to several decades ago, schools teach a lot more about climate change, there's less blatant Christianity in schools, and probably the one upsetting PragerU the most, they take a more critical look at US history, particularly while examining the history of racism. The ethos of conservatism is opposition to change, so naturally they're upset over this subjectively good educational trend. But also, the trend isn't even nearly as extreme as they like to claim. For all the conservative whining on critical race theory infiltrating the classroom, the US education system, frankly, does a really bad job on racism. It's treated like it disappeared in 1965 with Martin Luther King's I Had a Dream speech. And only 8% of high schoolers can even correctly identify slavery as the main cause of the Civil War. That's a fact so basic, even PragerU got it right. It's kind of jarring watching so many people get so violently upset by a positive shift in public education, and to then realize that the positive shift isn't even really happening that much in the first place. But you know, if the right didn't whine about nothing, they'd have nothing to keep their voting bloc focused. Also, I very much enjoy that the stock footage chosen for values that run counter to the conservative parents is a group of young people with signs that say, "Love, not hate." Just really saying the quiet part out loud.
I'm very thankful that Prager University has created PrEP. I think it is a fantastic support hub for parents like me who are wondering, how are we going to raise our kids against this mainstream media groupthink?
You know, you could make a great drinking game out of taking a shot whenever a conservative says one of those buzzwords that they have to make them angry. Mainstream media, woke, gender ideology. The only problem is that you'd be dead of alcohol poisoning within minutes. But yeah, PrEP's goal is to give parents and or teachers the resources to turn their kids into little right-wing stooges. The stuff they offer on their page is access to PrEP's private discussion forum, where you can connect with like-minded parents, guardians, grandparents, and educators, which, you guessed it, is code for access to a Facebook group. Breaking updates and early access to PragerU Kids content. Invitations to exclusive virtual events with other PrEP members. Originally, I had planned to join PrEP so that I could get access to the materials and show them to y'all, but unfortunately, joining costs $25, and while I have that money, I can't justify giving any money to PragerU. Fortunately, this is the internet. So there's plenty of stuff I could find that wasn't locked behind paywalls. First up are the PrEP reading lists, a collection of Amazon wish lists full of books that conservative parents can buy and make their kids read. They have a list for every age group. The reading list for young children includes all of the PragerU children's books. Yes, those are a thing. More on that later. The middle school list includes the Tuttle Twins series, whose explicit purpose are to instill conservative ideas into kids and the Rush Revere series, written by professional corpse Rush Limbaugh. Fun fact, I was given a couple of these books as a gift when I was like 11. They sucked. The list for teenagers is the best, though. It has Orwell, with no sense of self-awareness, Up from Slavery by Booker T. Washington, the favorite slave narrative of people who think pull yourself up by your bootstraps is a feasible solution for systemic racism. Atlas Shrugged by Ayn Rand, no surprise there. And there's also Will Witt's book, Candace Owens' book, 2 of Dennis Prager's books, and 7, count them, 7 Ben Shapiro books. You know, it's almost like a lot of this conservative commentator stuff is just an easy way to make money. And my heart goes out to any kid whose parent is actually using these lists. Besides just reading lists, prep also includes study materials. Study materials for what, you ask? Why, for PragerU videos, of course. Let me introduce you to the 245-page prep study guide. Wait, 245 pages? Gah, you'd spend more than the $25 just printing that out. Well, anyways, the study guide covers several videos, including The Free Market Will Set You Free and Margaret Thatcher, the Woman Who Saved Great Britain. We're going to take a look at the guide for who's more radical, the left or the right, because I've already done a video on that one, and I do not want to watch the Margaret Thatcher video. So at the top here, we have some key terms. Crazies is my personal favorite, very academic. Then there are some questions to be answered during and after the video. If the left got everything it wanted, how high could income taxes go? Oh, gee, probably 1,000,000,000%. On the next page, there are some discussion questions. The questions are all bad, but I don't think I've ever seen a question with as much a slant as, seeing as how raising the cost of electric bills so much would negatively impact low-income families so severely, do you think supporting the left and having them pass the Green New Deal would be worth it? Why or why not? Then, there's an opinion piece from Forbes about how single-payer healthcare is bad, with accompanying questions like, in what ways would single-payer healthcare take freedom away from Americans? And finally, there's a multiple choice quiz and answer key. And if you aren't seriously concerned right now, you should be, because this format is alarmingly similar to a lot of actual assignments you get in American schools. I know I had countless assignments that looked like this, but with questions about like feudal Japan instead of the left destroying America. Can you guess why it looks so much like an actual worksheet? PragerU is making these study guides because they want homeschooling parents to use them. Amidst all the other culture war bullshit, the right has been making a big push against public schooling and for homeschooling. Conservative activists like Candace Owens decry public schools as mass-producing woke activist children. And when she says this, PragerU is right there to plug prep. The prep community is full of conservative parents who pulled their kids out of public school because of this manufactured outrage over woke ideology. And they're giving their kids these study guides because they want little Timmy to be conservative like them. But I don't think that the only people using these materials are those hoping to politically indoctrinate their kids. I can't say this for certain, but I suspect some people are probably using this just because homeschooling is really hard. Try as they might, pretty much no parent has the skill or time to be as good as an actual school with actual teachers. A lot of them just give their kids some worksheet they found online. And all PragerU content is designed to give an impression of professionalism. So it's hardly a stretch to imagine some parent might find this, not look too closely, and pass it on to their kid. And it isn't just homeschooling parents using PragerU materials to teach. Lest you forget that the E in PrEP stands for educators. There's been countless accounts of teachers showing PragerU materials in class. Conservatives complain endlessly about political agendas being pushed in American schools. Well, here's the agenda. Now this happens for a couple reasons. It may seem like a government cover-up, but I've done some research and it turns out that teachers are actually people. And people have their own political opinions. teachers can absolutely let their political bias slip into the course materials. And if a conservative teacher finds a short, professional-looking video that confirms their pre-existing biases, they would need a lot of willpower to not slap it into the curriculum. Another part of the problem is just the struggle that public schools face. Underfunded districts often need to outsource their materials and use online sources. And lots of teachers just like to show YouTube videos in class. It lightens their load a little and can help to keep students engaged. I know that I saw my fair share of Crash Course, Bill Nye, and Oversimplified in school. But remember, PragerU content is no crash course. It's unsourced propaganda pushing a far-right political ideology. Have you ever wondered why not every PragerU video has an explicit political message? Sure, there's videos like Build the Wall and Money in Politics. What's the problem? But for every one of those, you have a Frederick Douglass, From Slave to Statesman, or a Who is Booker T. Washington, where there's definitely still an agenda, but it isn't explicit. They're the sort of video that you could theoretically show in a class without raising too much controversy. And then the kids go home, look up Prager University on YouTube, and down the rabbit hole they go. Like PragerFORCE, prep also has an element of organizing to it. But while the extent of PragerFORCE organizing is promoting PragerU videos, prep does something that only adults can manage: bitching to school officials. Yes, here is the Prep Parent Action Guide for Critical Race Theory. PragerU has created their own policy for how to address CRT in U.S. schools, and they've created a template letter that parents can fill out to annoy the school board, principal, or superintendent. You can read the whole thing if you want, but the part of the letter I want to highlight is, I'm concerned about it because summarize your opposition in a couple of sentences. Insert facts or statements from experts who also oppose. Now, this right here is the biggest failure with the template letter, because when you leave people to actually come up with their own reasons for hating critical race theory, you're not actually going to get that much. Hard to vocalize your opposition for a topic that you don't understand, you know? But assuming they come up with something, the parents will then send in this letter and include the PragerU solution to the problem that they made up. What's the solution? Creating a school unity board to control how teachers are allowed to talk about politics and divisive issues, which is of course code for anything that we don't like. I'll repeat that. The solution from the people who constantly whine about big government and 1984 is to create an extra layer of bureaucracy to police the curriculum. It's just pure parody at this point. But of course, the policy doesn't end at the committee. They also outline all the things that they want banned from being discussed in the classroom. Critical race theory, diversity, equity, and inclusion, the 1619 Project. Okay, so it's about what you'd expect. But they also want to ban stuff like boycott, divest, sanction, shared identity affinity groups, which I assume means stuff like gay-straight alliances and African-American culture clubs, neither of which are exclusive, but I suppose it's divisive to acknowledge gay people or talk about Black history. Although my personal favorite policy has to be, no member of the school's community will be asked or required to publicly or privately select and or confirm their gender identity. Which I know they reject to on the basis that gender identity is a thing, but in practice, this just means kids won't be able to take surveys. Reading through all of this stuff, it's pretty clear that PragerU is using this anti-CRT hysteria to just try to get everything they personally don't like taken out of schools, while couching it all in the language of unity. They'll say, we are committed to teaching American history while acknowledging that slavery and racism are wrong and immoral. But you can't have an honest discussion of slavery and racism if you refuse to acknowledge that they're both ongoing problems in America. Honestly, with how much they want to micromanage the curriculum, it's no wonder they're so into homeschooling. You know, the biggest problem with public education is that there is still a certain level of standards for actually having facts. So overall, what's the point of prep? Well, if PragerU as a whole is focused on turning kids into conservatives, then PrEP exists to facilitate that process. They want to infiltrate traditional education by getting teachers to put PragerU on the curriculum and getting parents to force anything that they dislike out of the curriculum. But this isn't enough. PragerU also wants to drive a wedge between parents and schools so that more and more parents will turn to homeschooling, where Prager University is the only thing on the agenda. This sort of thing is hardly new from the right. Most notably, the Daughters of the Confederacy were a group of racist women who pushed for pro-Confederacy books and narratives to be used in American schools. That's why the country's teaching on slavery is still so bad today. This is why something like PrEP is such a serious issue. We don't need to guess at what the consequences may be because we already know. When education is held from progress, society will be held back too. If they control the schools, pretty soon we'll be raising a generation of PragerU kids. Wait, PragerU kids? Why does that sound so familiar? You have got to be kidding me. Now, it's no secret that PragerU content has always been targeted towards kids and teens. They've made some attempts to deny this, saying in recent videos that the 5-minute video series was always meant for adults, but this is demonstrably false. They have playlists on their website with titles like For the Whole Family and New Releases for Teens, and the marketing campaign has always focused heavily on teenagers. But the 5-minute videos have always been watched by adults too, and it's hard to imagine many little kids are actually watching them. Most kids would rather watch a video about like Spider-Man than progressive income tax, you know? But PragerU refuses to let any demographics slip out of their reach, and thus, in 2021, they launched PragerU Kids, an offshoot of the PrEP program that consists of content specifically targeted towards young children. And they're pouring a lot of money and effort into creating as much of it as they can. According to their 2021 annual donor report, PragerU spent $4.3 million on PragerU Kids last year, with 42% of that being on production. To put that into perspective, the production budget for PragerU Kids is about half of that for all other PragerU content combined. So they're really trying to quickly build up a massive catalog. And it's working. In the past 2 months, the PragerU Kids channel has released 26 videos. They currently have 5 separate kids video series, with a 6th one on the way. They've released 8 children's books, and they've created a variety of kids magazines and activity pages. And because I love nothing more than being thorough, we're going to be taking a brief look at all of them today. But before we delve into the content, we first need to meet the face of PragerU Kids. Now obviously, the face of PragerU as a whole is Dennis Prager, but the director of outreach for PrEP and PragerU Kids is Jill Simonian. Jill spent most of the past few decades working as a TV host and contributor on various local news stations, mostly doing parenting advice columns, because if you couldn't tell by her Twitter handle, Jill Simonian, the Fab Mom, is in fact a mommy blogger. I didn't look much into her blog, but it seems to just be normal Christian mom fare. Though there are a few notably conservative posts, like a very proud statement on having an in-person Thanksgiving during the pandemic, where she weirdly invokes her deceased mother while talking about how COVID deaths don't particularly concern her. But all this made her a perfect fit for PragerU. She loves conservative politics, and they love D-list celebrities. With that out of the way, let's look at some PragerU Kids content. To start, let's look at the How-To series, and the video, How to Be Reasonably Green. Yeah, in case you forgot, PragerU is funded by fossil fuel billionaires.
Do you use too much stuff? Too many paper towels? Too much hot water? Too much toilet paper? Well, then you should stop. Being conscious of the environment is an important part of being a good citizen. That being said, some people unfortunately go little nuts on being green.
Can we turn down the thermostat? It's a little warm in here.
Hopefully nobody actually does that. But there are actually many ways to be green without going crazy and actually save money in the process. So here are 5 ways for you to be reasonably green.
So yeah, this how-to video is essentially just recycling a bunch of personal level be green advice that you've been hearing from plenty of outlets for decades. Stuff like turn off electronics when you aren't using them, and clean up litter. Plenty of people have pointed out that this type of singular action, while still good, is ultimately ineffective at combating climate change because of the systemic pollution on the part of big companies and getting most of our energy from non-renewable sources. And while this is a fair point, PragerU is well beyond even the individual solutions will solve climate change mindset. Because besides exclusively talking about individual actions, they also brush away any concern about climate change as hysteria.
But what you should not do is panic. The world is not going to explode into a flaming ball of charcoal because you used a plastic straw.
Seriously, man? What about the turtles?
And their section on buying local seems more focused on hating China than caring about the environment.
It saves shipping containers, boxes, and energy spent on transporting items overseas, and helps by supporting Americans in your community. Who doesn't want that? Also, communism. There's that. Chinese. You try not to support them.
Y'all know stuff is manufactured in China because it's cheaper, right? Outsourcing manufacturing to countries with lower labor standards isn't communist. Anyways, this video is latching on to the genuine concern over climate change and riding the wave of be green sentimentality, both to get easy views and to make PragerU look slightly less like heartless leeches sucking all the money they can out of the fossil fuel companies that are ruining our planet. But of course, fossil fuel funding and a general habit of being wrong means they can't actually care about climate change. So the How to Be Green video becomes less about protecting the environment and more about how bad, crazy, and wrong some people are for wanting to. The series includes other videos like How to Not Be a Screen Addict, an odd choice for an organization that is constantly publishing online content, and How to Prep for a Job. These videos combine issues kids might actually sort of care about with what academics have termed haha random XD humor, because they hope to be something of an onboarding tool for PragerU. If you watched How to Deal with Peer Pressure, you may go on to watch the rest of PragerU's catalog. The second series I want to take a look at is TBH History, because if there's one thing that the kiddos love, it's acronyms. TBH History is a series of around 10-minute videos on various historical events, and in case you're wondering, yes, there is plenty of haha random XD humor in this too.
Walnuts! I hate walnuts!
It's in these videos that we get an idea of how the people at PragerU think history should be taught. It should be incredibly sanitized and should paint their beliefs as the best. Their video on the Industrial Revolution, for example, neglects to mention things like child labor and the environmental impacts of coal power, but does credit laissez-faire capitalism as the primary reason Britain was the first country to industrialize. And while it was certainly a reason, Britain also benefited from the agricultural revolution, allowing for less people to need to work producing food, a vast, easily accessible supply of coal, advantageous geography, with plenty of rivers for easy transport of materials, relative political stability, and, oh yeah, the largest colonial empire in the world, giving them a massive amount of natural resources. You can absolutely give capitalism some credit for the Industrial Revolution, but to pretend it was the only thing is pretty dishonest. A sentiment that PragerU would seem to agree with, because their video on the American Revolution starts like this.
Look at this photograph. What do you see?
From this perspective, it looks dark and depressing. But look what happens when we zoom out. A very different picture emerges.
A lot of people treat American history like this photograph. They zoom in on one particular part and build a fancy frame around it.
This one piece is what American history is all about.
But you will miss out on seeing the whole picture if you only focus on one small part.
Or in other words, you need accurate perspective to make accurate conclusions.
Despite opening part 1 talking about looking at the whole picture, over the course of 2 10-minute videos, there is no mention of slavery. Seriously, the closest we get is a passing reference to Martin Luther King Jr. When it comes to teaching American history, especially to kids, I see a lot of people say that you can't go into too much detail on the negative aspects because it's not age appropriate. But omitting the unsavory elements of history gives kids an incomplete view of historical events. You can't ignore history just because it's inconvenient. Conservatives wail endlessly about political correctness, but this right here is the single most widespread example of political correctness in the country: the refusal to acknowledge the negative aspects of American history. The reason for American independence is written off merely as taxes and tyranny, and while those were principle, you almost never hear about the concern over the British inciting slave revolts and enlisting Native Americans to fight against the colonial government. This was a big enough grievance to make it into the Declaration of Independence. And with over 25,000 black soldiers estimated to have served across both sides of the Revolutionary War, it's actually harder to ignore them than to include them in your historical account. PragerU's recount of the history is severely weakened by their political bias. When the most you're willing to go against the Founding Fathers is that they weren't literally perfect, without going into any details as to what was imperfect about them, you aren't going to be able to produce anything that can accurately be called TBH history. For our third series, we're going to look at the craft show, Craftery. This is one of 2 shows hosted by Jill Simonian, and its shtick is giving out dubious history lessons and then doing a craft, which they definitely found on some parenting blog.
Welcome to Craftery by Prep, PragerU resources for educators and parents. We've got crafts, history, and your questions. I'm Jill, and today we're making an American apple pie in a microwave.
You know, I get accused of hating America by conservatives on occasion, and all I have to say is that if I really, really hated America, cooking an apple pie in a microwave would be my first choice for expressing that hatred. That aside, we've got the craft. Where's the history? And our questions.
What's that? We've got a question.
Why do people say as American as apple pie? Was apple pie created in America?
Good question. The answer is not really, but sort of.
Yeah, the answer is no. And the finished product looks about how you'd expect. Soggy, undercooked, Chef Ramsay would be furious. But bad pie I can excuse. Bad history I cannot. Let's take a look at the MLK Day video, the I Have a Dream, No Sew pillow. Because as we all know, Martin Luther King Jr. only said one sentence in his entire life.
I have a dream that my 4 little children will one day live in a nation where they will not be judged by the color of their skin, but by the content of their character. His dream came true and continues to live today.
Despite how comfortable it makes conservatives to pretend that it has been, MLK's dream is far from realized, because MLK's dream went beyond technical equality under the law. Martin Luther King's push for economic equality in the form of things like reparations and job guarantees goes wholly ignored by conservatives, because the things that King wanted are the same things that they despise. It's dishonest and disrespectful to reduce MLK to one quote and a fucking pillow. But PragerU Kids isn't just made up of videos. There's also several collections of activity pages, biography magazines, and global issues magazines. The activity pages are all pretty barren, even for the target audience of 5-year-olds. The Virtue of Patriotism activity, for example, consists of a Dennis Prager coloring page and a star coloring page, and the Virtue of Freedom activity consists of a Ronald Reagan coloring page and Reagan trivia. The hypocrisy of using the man who kicked off mass incarceration to represent the virtue of freedom does not seem to occur to them. Well, frankly, those are just boring. So let's check out the Global Issues magazines. This series takes a look at the lives and experiences of imaginary kids in various countries around the world. We're going to take a look at the one set in Venezuela. Can you guess what they're going to be talking about? If you guessed socialism, don't give yourself any points. Of course they're going to be talking about socialism. So yeah, if you've ever seen a Time for Kids or National Geographic Kids magazine, this is sort of in the same style. Very colorful, lots of drawings. The only difference is that the primary aim of the PragerU magazine is leading kids towards adopting a hardline anti-leftist worldview. To summarize the position presented in the magazine, they claim that Venezuela was prospering thanks to the help of foreign oil companies until the government, quote, decided to try socialism and nationalize their oil industry. Socialism is defined by them as a system where you are not allowed to own anything individually, and the government controls what everyone can buy and own, which is not what socialism is. They then claim that since only the smart foreign oil companies knew how to manage the oil, that the economy failed, ignoring both that the price of oil fell sharply at the time and that the state-owned petrol company was still partnered with foreign oil corporations and structured to run as a business. So if the supposed expertise of the foreign oil companies was so valuable, they sure didn't show it. They then advanced to the election of Hugo Chavez and pinned the second oil-related economic crisis on a combination of overspending and overdependence on oil, which were both factors, but there's no mention of any economic sanctions by the US, nor any acknowledgement that an overdependence on oil is not inherent to socialism, or that Venezuela is not in actuality a socialist state. The rhetoric of a nation's leader, an individual, is largely irrelevant to what economic system the nation as a whole actually implements. Like with most conservative talk on Venezuela, the concern seems less about the people living through this crisis and more about blaming socialism. And then, at the end, there's an activity page and a recipe for arepas. Yeah, kind of a tonal shift. I mean, I love Miguel Cabrera and all, but not exactly what I'm expecting after reading 8 pages of ranting about socialism. The final set of children's magazines are the biography magazines, and I think you can tell a lot about what these are like just by looking at the people they chose to feature. Margaret Thatcher, Amy Coney Barrett, Andrew Jackson, Ayn Rand, Condoleezza Rice. It's pretty much just a list of historical figures who did horrific things, and contemporary figures that agree with PragerU's politics. I decided to read the one on Cornelius Vanderbilt. It seems that the conservative obsession with defending the ultra-rich doesn't only apply to the living, because PragerU complains that Vanderbilt was maligned as a robber baron by many modern historians. And in the glossary section, they define malign as to make evil, harmful, and often untrue statements about someone. So they're calling historians who criticize Vanderbilt evil liars. And of course, reading the account PragerU gives, Vanderbilt is presented as a bootstrap-pulling icon, rising from a relatively poor background to being the richest man in the US through seemingly just elbow grease and good business decisions. Although curiously, the magazine makes very little mention of Vanderbilt's time as a rail tycoon. There's only one little passage at the end devoted to that. They describe his rise to rail dominance as such. During the 1850s, he began investing in railroads, buying stock, and ultimately acquiring multiple railroad lines in the Northeast. If that seems like a pretty sparse account, that's because it is. PragerU opts to leave out the part of the story where Vanderbilt shut down the rail bridge that all the other railroads relied on waited for their stock to drop, and then bought their stock and took over. I don't think you can get more hostile takeover than that. Again, we're seeing PragerU rewrite history by leaving out the parts they don't like. They want to promote the idea of Vanderbilt as a great person, because to them, he represents the greatness of capitalism. But they can't pretend he's perfect and admit he engaged in hostile business practices, so they just don't. They want to fault socialism for the failure of the Venezuelan economy, but they can't do that honestly, so they ignore the oil prices falling, they ignore the US sanctions, and they ignore that Venezuela wasn't and isn't actually socialist. Earlier, I referenced PragerU's kids' books. Yes, PragerU is making actual real books that parents can buy and read to their unfortunate children. The series is called Otto's Tales and stars the titular Otto, Dennis Prager's dog, as the point of view character. Also featured is a child version of Dennis Prager. I'd say that's the weirdest thing about this series if it weren't for the giant Otto mascot costume that shows up in some of the videos. And the actual books are pretty strange too. I wasn't going to buy any of them, but they've made every book into a video, so I didn't need to. The videos are split into two categories: original stories, where Otto and Dennis go back in time to historical events. These are the ones that get actual book releases. And stories that are in the public domain that I suppose they just make videos out of in order to upload more content. This is stuff like The Tortoise and the Hare, The Pitcher and the Crow, and George Washington and the Cherry Tree. It's all very cheaply animated, and I'm not really interested in taking a look at it, but the original stories have a variety of choices, from Today is MLK Jr. Day, which contains more lies about MLK, to Today is 9/11, where Dennis Prager goes back in time to 9/11. To do what? Why, to get a view of New York from atop the Twin Towers. What? You know, most time travel stories that go back to 9/11 try to prevent it, but I guess Dennis just wanted the first-hand experience. We aren't going to be looking at those, however, because I just couldn't resist Today is Columbus Day. Most of the videos are narrated by Jill Simonian, but this one features a guest narrator, noted fucking liar and genocide denier Michael Knowles. Regular viewers of the channel may remember the video I did on his video about Columbus, and in this video, most of those talking points are repackaged for a child audience. It begins with Dennis and Otto celebrating Columbus Day when they decide to travel back in time to meet Columbus.
We landed in Spain in 1492. Christopher Columbus was about to sail the ocean blue. "I'm a Christopher," he said. "Nice to meet you."
Yeah, Knowles commits to the Italian accent for the whole video. He even does it for the King of Spain, weirdly enough.
"We want to send you on more voyages, not just 2, but 3.
Just
unbelievable.
The actual story focuses mostly on how Columbus was such a big-brain genius navigator who stumbled across a place he didn't know existed and extracted a bunch of wealth out of it. But because PragerU is so committed to getting the whole picture, it also covers the negatives.
And there were natives here who were of a different race. The settlers and natives got along quite a lot, but also had trouble with each other, and sometimes they fought.
Yeah, that is the farthest this story goes into the atrocities committed against the indigenous populations of the Americas. No mention is made of Columbus enslaving natives as soon as he made landfall, or the encomienda system of slavery the European settlers would institute. No mention of the rape that we know Columbus at the very least permitted amongst his crew, if not directly committed. No mention of genocide. One may argue that this would obviously not be present. This is a book for children, after all. But in case you forgot, they made a book on 9/11. So this series is not afraid to tackle difficult topics, but rather it is afraid to question the dogma of American, and let's be honest, white supremacy that is integral to the US conservatives' worldview. Instilling that worldview is the point of the series. So Columbus is held up for what he represents to that worldview, as the ending of the book makes apparent.
We honor Columbus for his courage, for being the first person to connect the New World to the Old World of Europe, and for making America possible.
The people he killed and the lives he ruined are irrelevant, as long as we're on top. God bless America. Finally, PragerU Kids' flagship series is Leo and Layla's History Adventures. It stars the titular Leo and Layla, a brother and sister duo who have the same dead-eyed look as the fish for sale in a grocery store. Leo is the younger brother. He has blue hair and pronouns, and Layla is also there, I guess. I don't know. They're just props for right-wing talking points. Their personalities aren't really relevant. In the series, they travel through time to meet various historical figures, because apparently PragerU is lazy enough to use the exact same plot for 2 of their shows. Oh, but in Otto's Tales, they use some random object to time travel, whereas in Leo and Layla, they use an app. So it's very different. In the first episode, the siblings are engaging in what I assume is the favorite activity of conservative children, telling each other trivia about Ronald Reagan.
Did you know that Ronald Reagan was one of our most popular presidents?
Of course I knew that.
And did you know he was California's governor before he was president?
Well, duh. Did you know that he started out as an actor? He starred in over 50 movies.
Yeah, and he wasn't just an actor either. He was in the military during World War II.
You know what? He was actually great at a lot of stuff. He played college football.
He was also on the swim team.
He ran track, too.
Plus, he was student body president.
And he was totally handsome.
Ew, gross.
What the heck, Leo?
Yeah, apparently conservatives can't talk about Ronald Reagan without just constantly sucking him off.
You are amazing, Mr. Reagan. You saved everyone's lives and made them better at the same time.
Well, thank you, Leo.
The rest of the episode is mostly just bragging about Reagan's supposed accomplishments, citing Reaganomics and the Just Say No program as major successes, despite that being demonstrably false. And in case you're wondering, none of the PragerU Kids videos ever cite a single source. The other video I took a look at was the Frederick Douglass one. It starts with Leo and Layla watching the news and getting upset over Black Lives Matter protests. They hear a protester on TV say, "Abolish the police," and because they don't know what the word abolish means, they travel back in time to meet Frederick Douglass, an abolitionist. Douglass is then used as a mouthpiece for PragerU to spout out their talking points, starting with the arguably slavery apologia, that is the "but there was slavery everywhere" argument, disregarding the unique cruelty of America's racial slavery system.
The sad fact is slavery has existed everywhere in the world for thousands of years, but it's especially disappointing here because America was founded on the idea of freedom, yet so many black people are not free.
And eventually moving towards congratulating America for being the first country to push for the end of slavery, despite that not being true.
There was no real movement anywhere in the world to abolish slavery before the American founding. Slavery was part of life all over the world. It was America that began the conversation to end it.
In addition to pushing their narrative on American slavery not being comparatively all that bad, PragerU makes sure to have Douglass write off the hypocrisy of the Founding Fathers.
How can there be slavery in America when the Founding Fathers said that all men are created equal?
Yeah, and I've heard that some of those Founding Fathers owned slaves. What about that?
Children, our Founding Fathers knew that slavery was evil and wrong, and they knew that it would do terrible harm to the nation. They wanted it to end, but their first priority was getting all 13 colonies to unite as one country. The southern colonies were dependent on slave labor, and they wouldn't have joined a union that had banned it.
If you're at all familiar with the speeches of Douglass, the phrase, "our Founding Fathers" there should be setting off some alarm bells in your head. Because in his most famous speech today, "What to the Slave is the 4th of July," Douglass draws a clear distinction between white Americans, who were actually afforded the liberties the Founding Fathers spoke of, and black Americans, to whom those liberties were denied. To Douglass, they were not our Founding Fathers, but rather your Founding Fathers. To Douglas and every other African American, they may have been impressive, learned, committed men, but their promises rang hollow. And I know PragerU read this speech because they later misuse a quote from it.
What's taking the southern states so long to do what's right?
Great streams are not easily turned from channels worn deep in the course of ages.
Huh?
What I mean is, sometimes things are more complicated than they might seem, and complicated problems take time to solve.
In the speech, Douglas is actually talking about how America, as a relatively young nation, still has a lot of potential to change for the better, turning this quote into a reasoning for why emancipation took so long misses the point entirely. The episode ends with Douglas telling the kids that fighting for civil rights is okay, unless the people doing it are radicals, which the episode earlier defines as wanting a complete change of everything. Lost on PragerU is that in his time, Douglas was considered a radical. While today, I suppose we can distinguish him from more hardline abolitionists because of things like his willingness to meet with slaveholders and not joining the raid on Harper's Ferry with John Brown, at the time, abolition in and of itself was a radical movement. Getting rid of a widespread system of slavery is a major fundamental change, and any advocate for such an action was considered a radical. And I just can't get over how the moral of a story about meeting an abolitionist is Black Lives Matter is going too far. Now that we've taken a look at the content PragerU Kids has to offer, there's two more questions that I want to answer. What is the purpose of PragerU Kids, and what is the impact of PragerU Kids? Let's start with the easier one, the impact. The PragerU Kids YouTube channel has about 5,000 subscribers. But looking at the views they get, you can't really tell. I've been checking their new uploads for a couple months now, and they'll regularly get less than 100 views in the first day. But while very few children appear to be watching PragerU Kids willingly, PragerU has never relied on willingness to put their videos in front of people. A video may get 80 views in its first 2 days, but on day 3, that number will shoot up to 80,000. Courtesy of PragerU Kids' over $1 million advertising budget. Like always, PragerU is using their masses of billionaire money to artificially inflate their reach. The audience for PragerU Kids content may be small now, but the audience for any PragerU content was small in 2011, and now your aunt won't stop tagging you in Facebook posts about public schools turning kids transgender. The purpose of PragerU Kids is multifaceted. First and foremost, the purpose of any PragerU video is to instill a conservative worldview in the viewer. Facts are not relevant because the goal is blind faith and conviction that you're right. When no amount of evidence will stray you from your original opinion, their mission is successful. PragerU Kids also exists to onboard the youth. It reeks so very desperately of a bunch of old people trying to appeal to kids. The animated characters with wacky hair colors, the dog costume, the weekly live streams reminiscent of Saturday morning cartoons. They target kids because kids are highly impressionable. When you're someone's first introduction to any political thought, it's very easy to convince them that your position is the correct one. How many people do you know that are conservative or liberal simply because they grew up with it and view that position as the baseline? We previously looked at how PragerU's PrEP program aimed to turn parents against public education, and PragerU Kids is yet another facet of that push. They not only want kids removed from public schools, but also don't want them seeing normal kids' cartoons, which in recent years have become increasingly accepting of stuff like the reality that LGBTQ people exist, or the idea that racism is bad. In the interest of preserving their worldview, conservatives have decided the best option is not exposing kids to the scary homosexuals and anti-racists, and instead sheltering them in a safe space of right-wing rhetoric. If you know anyone who's bringing their kids up on this stuff, maybe kindly suggest they cut it out with the bullshit. While this stuff can seem benign, it gives children an incorrect view of what actually happened in history, and can easily lead them down the path to some of PragerU's more blatantly horrific content. To any parents watching this, you're better off with Sesame Street. Elmo may be a little annoying, but he hasn't twisted the rhetoric of Martin Luther King Jr. as far as I'm aware. As we've seen, PragerU has a lot of projects: PragerFORCE, PrEP, PragerU Kids, and countless others. It's an incredibly diversified organization, which is ironic given how much they hate diversity. And while I think I've done a pretty good job at demonstrating what PragerU is, and it only took me enough time to fill a movie, in order to truly understand Prager University, you unfortunately need to know about the man behind it. So we're going to take a deeper dive on Dennis Prager. Now, before I get into it, I feel like I need to justify this. Do I really want to give Dennis Prager the satisfaction of doing a whole deep dive on him personally? Does that not bestow upon him undue importance? It's a question I grappled with quite a bit when I started making this. But ultimately, I feel it needs to be done, because as undue as it may be, Dennis Prager is an influential person. PragerU reaches millions of people, and while there are many people involved with it, it ultimately does revolve around Dennis Prager. He edits all the video scripts, and everything they released is based around his outlook and ideology. And outside of PragerU, Dennis also has significant reach in the Republican Party. He's not going anywhere, so the best I can do is shed some light on him. With that out of the way, who is Dennis Prager? To start, a brief biography. Born to Orthodox Jewish parents in 1948, Prager went to a private Orthodox school in New York City, where he was, by his own admission, a bad student. He didn't do homework, was sent to the principal's office regularly, and graduated near the bottom of his class. He attended Brooklyn College because it was the only place that would accept him, and it was there where he, like so many other conservative commentators, would essentially luck into a lucrative career. He won a scholarship to study abroad in England, and while in England, he was contacted by the Israeli government to travel to the Soviet Union and interview Jews about their lives there. Upon returning, he embarked on a 60-nation speaking tour, which got him the funds and the public profile to go forward with publishing his first book, The 9 Questions People Ask About Judaism, and turning it into a bestseller. The book would give way to more books, his own talk show, his own quarterly journal, his own radio show, and eventually Prager University. But moving past his life story, to find out who Dennis Prager actually is, we need to assess his thoughts. One of the defining factors of Prager's worldview is his religious beliefs. As mentioned earlier, Dennis grew up in an Orthodox Jewish household, and while he's since left modern Orthodoxy, he remains religious. And it shows in the output of PragerU, with them having released dozens of videos on religious topics over the years, such as the best book to read to your children. Spoiler alert, they think it's the Bible. Why even atheists should teach their children about God. A wild video in which they basically say atheists should just spend their whole lives acting like Christians because of some dubious correlation between children attending church and having better mental health. The obvious conclusion that children whose families take them to church are more likely to just have generally more attentive families escapes their grasp. You may have noticed a focus on Christianity. This is because Dennis is a major fan of Judeo-Christianity, a somewhat contentious term due to the implication that Christian beliefs supersede Judaic ones, as well as the history of anti-Semitism within Christianity. But for Dennis, the term allows him to reconcile his personal Judaic beliefs with the overwhelmingly Christian beliefs of his audience. PragerU makes a lot of arguments typical of the religious right, but they tend to frame their arguments through a secular lens in order to appeal to the largest possible audience. But make no mistake, these secular arguments tend to just be hastily assembled fronts. The starting position is the religious beliefs. Whether it's their opposition to abortion, fear-mongering over the term happy holidays, or a long, long history of homophobia. Now, homophobia is not a unique trait among conservative pundits. especially those that were active in the 80s and 90s. Indeed, homophobia was normalized among the population at large up until relatively recently. So is it entirely fair to hold Dennis Prager's homophobia against him? Yes. You see, when it comes to assessing bigotry, I think there's two categories that can help us in doing so. Is the bigotry born more out of ignorance or malice? Now, bigotry is usually a combination of the two, but for the vast majority of homophobes, I'd consider them bigoted primarily as a result of ignorance. They took the lazy path of just accepting the larger homophobic cultural narrative. Does this excuse their bigotry? No. But what you see with a lot of these types is that upon educating themselves, they'll often soften their views or change them entirely. It demonstrates that their homophobia was more a product of their environment than their genuine convictions. This is not the case for Prager. Bigots of ignorance tend to be like grandparents or teenagers who just don't know better. Whereas Dennis was incredibly proud of how educated he considered himself on matters of homosexuality. In 1990, Dennis wrote an essay called Judaism, Homosexuality, and Civilization. He claims this essay came after months of researching, and in it he argues against the normalization of homosexuality in the Jewish community, and weirdly, he creates a hierarchy of sexual sins from most tolerable to least, with premarital sex being the most tolerable, followed by celibacy, then adultery, then homosexuality, then bestiality, and then incest, which is a really weird list. Like, ignoring the homophobia, what's wrong with celibacy? It's just not having sex. And in case you were worried Dennis Prager thinks being gay is more acceptable than bestiality or incest, don't worry. He doesn't think it's much better. Saying of incest,
if love is the only issue, what's the problem? If you favor same-sex marriage, do you have an answer?
And saying of bestiality,
in all my research on this subject, nothing moved me more than the Talmudic laws that Jews were forbidden to sell slaves or sheep to non-Jews, lest the non-Jews engage in homosexuality and bestiality.
This one's notable because not only does he equate homosexuality and bestiality, but he also seems pretty fine with slavery as long as there's no gay shit happening. Prager would go on to testify before Congress in support of the Defense of Marriage Act, which defined marriage as a union between a man and a woman and aimed to block same-sex marriage in the US. And his testification is, frankly, buck wild. Because he's Dennis Prager, he asserts that heterosexuality is a Judeo-Christian value, and that the acceptance of homosexuality represents the downfall of those Judeo-Christian values, and in turn, the West. He also claims that being gay, while sometimes biological, is often a choice, citing as evidence that there were more accounts of gay men in ancient Greece than in Orthodox Jewish circles. What Prager either refuses to acknowledge or fails to comprehend is that in a society where homosexuality isn't stigmatized and prohibited, there is going to be more openly gay people. He also claims that calling people who oppose gay marriage homophobic is a contemporary form of McCarthyism, saying,
to hold that heterosexual marital sex is preferable to all other expressions of sexuality is no more homophobic than it is sibling-phobic to oppose incest, or animal-phobic to want humans to make love only to their own species.
Like the Richard Spencer types who say, I'm not racist, I don't hate black people, I just think whites should have their own homeland. Dennis aims to veer the conversation of his bigotry way off course by redefining what bigotry is. Denying gay people the right to get married and holding a heterosexual supremacist worldview is unabashedly homophobic. He claims the term only applies to those who commit hate crimes, but that's just not true. There's levels to this shit. You don't need to actually beat up a gay person to be homophobic, any more than you need to actually join the Klan to be racist, or actually brandish a swastika to be anti-Semitic. Someone who commits a hate crime is not any more of a bigot than they were 10 seconds beforehand. Hate crimes are actions people commit because of their bigoted ideology, not by random chance. Dennis says that good, caring people can debate the merits of gay marriage, but denying the rights of a group of people in favor of unrelenting debate upon them does not seem particularly caring. And indeed, when it comes to the question of gay marriage, Dennis seems to care less about the rights of gay people and to care more about covering his own ass, as we can see in 2012 with his article, Why a Good Person Can Vote Against Same-Sex Marriage. Prager starts the article playing the centrist, as he's wont to do, claiming that there are
fine people on both sides of the debate,
before pivoting to his real belief that accepting gay marriage is bad for society. To evidence this stupid claim, he cites some truly horrible events, such as Harvard hiring a non-binary person, eHarmony allowing gay people to match on their dating site, and Google Plus having an other option for your gender. Truly, these are earth-shaking disasters. Western civilization may never recover. Unless you think from the start of the article that Dennis actually considers proponents of gay marriage decent people, the final line of the article is,
there are reasons no moral thinker in history ever advocated same-sex marriage.
Like so much of Prager's politics, the goal is to appear reasonable at first glance while couching your extreme worldview. Now, back to our initial question. Is it fair to hold Dennis Prager's past homophobia against him today? And here's where I reveal it's been a trick question all along, because Prager's homophobia is not relegated to the past. This 2012 article has been reposted by PragerU's Twitter as recently as 2021. Dennis Prager's beliefs have not changed. Society has merely changed around him. And for a more egregious recent example, if you were paying attention to the news in 2021, you may have seen some comments Dennis Prager made get a lot of coverage. You see, Dennis, as is conservative tradition at this point, contracted COVID in fall of 2021, and shortly after, he made a comment on Newsmax that gay people during the AIDS crisis were not as big of pariahs as unvaccinated people during COVID. A frankly wild claim from someone who was there during the AIDS crisis, making gay people into pariahs. And this relates to earlier claims from Dennis that heterosexual AIDS is a made-up lie liberals tell to generate hysteria. And while HIV is perhaps best known for its extreme toll on gay men in New York City, newsflash, straight people aren't immune to the virus. You know, I would have hoped that Magic Johnson contracting the virus, arguably the most high-profile illness of the century, would be enough to make people realize that this can happen to anybody, but evidently not. Dennis Prager has a long and blatant history of homophobia, and I suspect when faced with it, he'd claim to be the victim of a McCarthyist slander campaign, and insist that you were simply incapable of refuting his arguments. Prager has coined the term sixherb in reference to people calling him sexist, intolerant, xenophobic, homophobic, Islamophobic, racist, and/or bigoted. And while there isn't nothing to the idea that these terms can get thrown around loosely sometimes, at a certain point, we have to call it like it is. Dennis, people don't call you homophobic because they can't account for your political beliefs. They call you homophobic because that's their evaluation of your political beliefs. You can't spend your entire career opposing gay people at every turn, saying gay marriage is worse than the economy crashing, saying tolerance for gay people is akin to a fascist takeover of the US, and then be shocked and appalled that people think you don't like gay people. Prefacing everything with, there are some decent homosexuals, means jack shit when you follow up with, the immoral gays will be the downfall of civilization. Speaking of the collapse of civilization, let's talk about COVID-19. I mentioned that Dennis got COVID, but he's done so much more that we just kinda need to go over it. When Dennis actually got COVID, he made quite a big show of it. He boasted to his audience that he had contracted it intentionally in order to get, quote, natural immunity. How did he go about this? By engaging in close physical contact with as many people as he could. Assuming he's telling the truth about this, Dennis almost certainly spread the virus to many other people. I don't think I need to give a whole dissertation on how knowingly spreading disease to other people is a dick move, but the direct impact on a couple dozens pales in comparison to the indirect impact on thousands of his listeners. Dennis, as you can probably guess, is a strong advocate of alternative, or more accurately, ineffective treatments for COVID-19. He claimed to have been taking ivermectin, and given that he didn't literally die, saw this as evidence that ivermectin was an effective treatment, and the COVID vaccine is unnecessary. He also weirdly took credit for the CDC publishing a study which demonstrated that immunity granted by the vaccine was more effective at protecting against COVID than natural immunity. If you know anything about how scientific studies work, you know that this claim is ludicrous. Dozens of scientists and doctors are not devoting their limited time and resources during a pandemic to sticking it to Dennis Prager. That's my job. But since the beginning of the pandemic, Dennis has been following the Republican Party line, including his virulent resistance to any degree of health and safety protocols during a deadly pandemic. In response to lockdowns and mask mandates, he's adopted the catchphrase, "When it's safe means never," which is more of a statement on the US's weak response to the virus than anything. But this phrase can and has led to embarrassment, because PragerU tweeted it several times in November and December of 2020, which, in case you forgot, was about a week before we hit the peak of deaths in the United States. Like, did Dennis see a 9/11's worth of people dying every day and think, now is the time to stop caring about the virus? His stance comes off as needlessly cruel, but it's not surprising given he clearly values the ability of the rich to make money over the rest of us to stay healthy. Now, if you're familiar enough with Dennis Prager, you knew this part was coming. It's time to talk about the marital rape article. You see, Prager doesn't just consider himself the preeminent source on all matters of politics, faith, logic, and morality. He's also a love guru. If you dive deep into the PragerU catalog, you may come across some titillating videos like Dating, Don't Waste Your Time, Men and the Power of the Visual, and He Wants You. But if there's one thing that best demonstrates his views on relationships and gender roles in a broader sense, it's a series of articles published on his website. In these articles, titled When a Woman Isn't in the Mood, Parts 1 and 2, Dennis aims to tackle the worst problem facing romantic relationships: consent.
It is an axiom of contemporary marital life that if a wife is not in the mood, she need not have sex with her husband. Here are some arguments for why a woman who loves her husband might want to rethink this axiom.
I hope it's not controversial to say that if you're going to have sex with someone, both parties should want to do so. Dennis frames sex as a duty that a woman is bound to perform for her husband, rather than a mutually enjoyable experience, saying,
"A husband knows that his wife loves him first and foremost by her willingness to give her body to him."
But I'm going to have to disagree there. There's a myriad of ways to express your love for your spouse, but I can't imagine an unenthusiastic fuck because you feel bound by some marital duty as a more serious expression of love than, say, leaving someone roses by the stairs. After all, surprises let you know she cares. Dennis elaborates on his views of women putting out as a duty in part 2, saying a woman denying her husband sex because she's not in the mood is comparable to a man not going to work because he's not in the mood, and claiming women do other things when they're not in the mood, saying,
most women never regard it as hypocritical and rightly regard it as admirable when they meet their child's or parents' or friends' needs when they are not in the mood to do so. They do what is right in those cases rather than what their mood dictates. Why not apply this attitude to sex with one's husband?
And Dennis, if sex with you is this much of a chore, that really might just be a you problem. After all, he wrote this right after getting married for the 3rd time. So given what he's written, is it completely fair to categorize these articles as an endorsement of marital rape? It's been a rather hotly contested debate among people with too much time on their hands. And given that I have the absolute most time on my hands, I'm going to weigh in and say, while it may cover its tracks with quotes like,
there are men whose frequency of demands are excessive,
and stating that it should be a woman's choice to consent to sex despite not wanting to, when you're placing social pressure on a person to consent to sex they don't want to have, saying they're unkind for not providing sex to their husbands, claiming a smart woman doesn't let mood determine when she fucks. Whatever consent you get will have been given under significant pressure. It may not be rape under law, but it's skeevy as fuck and speaks to a broader social view that significantly undervalues the actual personhood and intelligence of women. Your wife is supposed to be the person you love the very most in the world. Why would you want to force upon her the idea she's only valuable as a vehicle for your sexual satisfaction? And that brings me to the worst part of this article, because this is just the grossest shit imaginable. Dennis projects his own warped views of social roles onto the entire male sex to argue with an imaginary woman. When the imaginary woman says,
men are animals,
Dennis responds with, hell yeah, I am, baby, before delivering the funniest quote in the article.
Telling your husband to control it is a fine idea, but he already does. Every man who is sexually faithful to his wife already engages in daily, heroic self-control. He is married, knowing he will have to deny his sexual nature's desire for variety for the rest of his life. To ask that he also regularly deny himself sex with the one person in the world with whom he is permitted sex is asking far too much.
You know, these people talk a lot about the importance of traditional, heterosexual, monogamous relationships, but they seem to just be thoroughly miserable with it. Dennis also shoots himself in the foot a little when he has his imaginary woman say,
my man only enjoys sex with me when I'm into it too.
And then proceeds to not address this point. Which, you know, is kind of a big deal when you think about it. The cool thing about arguing against a person you made up is that if there's a point you can't rebuke, you can just have them not say it. Instead, you've got everyone thinking, oh yeah, there's the guy that's only into it when she's not. Now, astute viewers may notice that these articles were written in 2008. Is it really fair to judge a man for comments made so long ago? Well, first off, he wrote this when he was like 60, so you really can't make a young and dumb argument. But also, Dennis Prager is a conservative media personality. His brand is built on being completely ideologically inflexible. He still believes all of this.
And basically what I said was this: given how important sex is to most men, it is, if you love your husband, and I said that, and he treats you well, don't always allow mood to determine whether you will sleep with him.
If you follow conservative politics for any amount of time, you're almost certain to notice that they're all massive hypocrites, all the time. It can make it very hard to tell if they actually hold any values beyond an all-consuming urge to own the libs. And like many of his peers, Dennis is no stranger to hypocrisy. For instance, as discussed earlier, Dennis hates the left's supposed proclivity for throwing around words like racist or homophobic, yet he himself holds no issue with calling others anti-Semitic, which I wouldn't have an issue with if it was done honestly, call that shit out. But Dennis employs the term more as a cudgel to silence dissent, in the exact manner that he accuses the left of acting in. He'll gleefully claim that Nazism and fascism has its roots in secularism, and that modern anti-Semitism comes near exclusively from the secular left. Although when pressed to give any, evidence for his claims, Dennis tends to flounder some. Although it's notable that his claims about the secular left being anti-Semitic would include a fair deal of Jewish people. And this isn't the only time Dennis has accused Jews of anti-Semitism, as he also considers Jewish people who take issue with Israel anti-Semitic. But while he's all too happy to push this frankly trash idea of self-hating Jews, he's comparatively unwilling to call out the influence of right-wing rhetoric on anti-Semitism. In an article he wrote responding to the ADL, Dennis ignores a rise in anti-Semitic incidents during 2016 and 2017 in order to defend Donald Trump, willfully mischaracterizing the position of the ADL while he's at it. Dennis is also fine ignoring anti-Semitism when he's casting for PragerU videos. And despite having made a PragerU video lauding America for its freedom of religion and religious tolerance, Dennis is notoriously intolerant of Islam. Beyond the countless PragerU videos, which, among other things, lightly call for a race war and claim anti-Semitism is a disease infecting the Arab mind, Dennis also argued that Keith Ellison, the first Muslim elected to the U.S. House, should not be allowed to swear in on the Quran. His argument is wild, falsely claiming that every elected official has sworn in on the Bible, when in reality, no book is used for the actual swearing in. Rather, House members can opt to have separate ceremonies, but even then, not all use a Bible. He also claimed Ellison swearing in on the Quran would do more damage to America than 9/11. Dennis is proud to champion America as religiously tolerant, and he praises the freedom of religion that the country has. But in practice, he fucking hates it. The Constitution says no religious test shall ever be required to hold public office in America. But Dennis says, if you won't swear in on the Bible, you're essentially worse than a terrorist. He'll champion the Constitution 1 minute and then ignore the Establishment Clause the next. On the less violently Islamophobic side, Dennis has plenty of videos giving romantic advice and is a particular advocate that one should get married early, which wouldn't be too objectionable, but the dude's been married 3 times. So, if the strategy clearly doesn't work, maybe hold off on being so eager to advise others to do it, unless your romance advice is be a double divorcee. It's clear that Dennis has 2 separate sets of rules. One rule set, which he wishes for everyone else to follow, and another rule set, under which he himself operates. And this set of rules for the rest of us is arguably the single most integral element to Dennis Prager's whole ideology. One idea often repeated in PragerU content is that of tolerance. Claim that the right is more tolerant than the left, because while the left decries people as bigots or Nazis simply because they say bigoted things or act like Nazis, the right champions a diversity of thought. Now, the typical leftist response to this idea is almost always a variation of Karl Popper's paradox of tolerance, which posits that a society cannot survive if it tolerates intolerance, because if you tolerate people who are intolerant, will inevitably seize power and persecute whatever group they're intolerant against. So by trying to be perfectly tolerant of thought, you create a far more intolerant society in the long run. Now, I think this is a fair point. Hats off to Dr. Popper on this one. But I think we miss out on something when we invoke this argument, because the paradox of intolerance would only apply if one was actually committed to a 4chan-esque society that completely tolerates any thought. But when it comes to Dennis Prager, and indeed the conservative movement at large, this is demonstrably not the case. For all his musings about diversity of thought, this is not what he actually wants. He wants a society where everyone thinks like he does. This is why he has literally thousands of hours of content trying to instill into his audience a certain lifestyle that he deems proper. Now, a defender may say he simply offers his own perspective on how one should live. He's not policing anyone's lives, he's just giving advice. But the life advice element only exists when he has no other option. When people's lives can be policed, Dennis is all for it. Whether that's denying gay couples the right to marry, forcing trans athletes out of sports, or mandating his own religion-based rules and standards on the rest of the country in everything from swearing into government to procuring an abortion. It's just an opinion for exactly as long as it takes to make it law. Now that we've come to the end of all of this, I'd like to once again return to our original question. What is PragerU? And while I think we all now know what PragerU is, to complete the question, we also need to know what PragerU is not. And it's here where things get really concerning. Because for all the things that PragerU is, lying, bigoted, targeting children, one thing that it is not is unique. A media outlet funded by the ultra-rich that spreads misinformation and lies in an attempt to promote a conservative political agenda? There are dozens of those. To name just a few, Turning Point USA, the Heritage Foundation, Focus on the Family, the Manhattan Institute, Act for America, the NRA, the Federalist Society. And targeting children isn't a unique niche either. You've got the Young Americans Foundation posting mediocre SpongeBob memes 4 times a day, and the Daily Wire, who are now pouring $100 million into their own kids' content. While I think it's pretty obvious that I find PragerU incredibly interesting, it's only one strand in a truly massive web that rich conservatives have constructed in hopes of catching enough public support to power through their policies. It's another insidious form of lobbying, where instead of buying votes through campaign contributions, you buy them indirectly by funding a think tank to spread out enough propaganda that you get the votes you need. Make sure to make some for the kids, too. It may be unethical, but that's never stopped you. And besides, it's a great return on investment. This sort of thing is pretty much inevitable in any society where you have incredibly rich people who want to hoard as much money as possible, and it's even harder to stop than traditional lobbying. If Citizens United was overturned tomorrow, PragerU would still upload their videos. The Daily Wire would still publish their articles. Turning Point USA would still send Charlie Kirk's tiny face to campuses across the country. You can theoretically fix rich people buying off politicians, but fixing rich people just paying to force their ideas onto everyone else? That's a lot more difficult. So, how do we fix it? Fuck if I know. Yeah, I spent the last few months watching kids' cartoons. Did y'all really expect me to have the solution for the conflict inherent between capitalism and democracy? Realistically, it's going to be insanely hard to do much at all, because the things we'd need to do are the same things the rich are spending billions to prevent. But I don't think it's impossible. In the Democratic primaries for the 2020 elections, billionaire Michael Bloomberg announced his candidacy late in the campaign, and proceeded to spend over $1 billion. For a few brief months before COVID hit, America was saturated with a different virus. Bloomberg had hundreds of offices and thousands of staffers. Influencers could get paid thousands of dollars a month to relentlessly promote Michael Bloomberg. His name was inescapable, no matter where you went. And when it was all said and done, and the results had all come in, he had won. American Samoa, a U.S. territory where Bloomberg dominated with 175 of 351 votes. Despite spending $1 billion, He failed spectacularly. Because while you can put your message in front of people, it doesn't work if they can see through your bullshit. But it's a lot easier to see a message for what it really is when it's coming from a creepy old dude with some pretty bigoted views. Whereas with PragerU, the message comes from, well, okay. Casual dunking aside, I think the main reason outlets like PragerU work where Bloomberg failed is that everyone knew what Bloomberg was doing, and they called him out for it. The way you combat these outlets is by seeing them for what they are, not just exposing that they lie, but also why they lie, and what money lies behind the lies. Like I've said, PragerU thrives on the politically uninformed to get their message to stick. The key to defeating this university is simply education. Thanks for watching. Like, comment, and subscribe. If you want to support me financially, you can donate to my Patreon and get your names listed with my lovely patrons, including the $10 and up patrons, Sleepy Boy Uwu. You can follow me on Twitter, Instagram, whatever. That's all linked in the description. And yeah.